There's a show that's airing on PBS that's been airing for, not currently, but for several years now, that is maybe kind of cool to some of you who are really into the detective drama, but also think, how could we add this to our church life? It's called Grantchester. And Grantchester, it's set in the town, Grantchester, which is just outside of Cambers, England. Set in the 1950s, and it follows Sidney Chambers, who is a vicar at the church over there in Grantchester. It just so happens, too, that Sidney also goes around and occasionally helps the police along with his priestly duties. He goes and helps them in solving murder cases. Now, throughout a good bit of the series, we've seen a little bit of Sidney's relationship with a close friend of his growing up named Amanda. And in the third season, the last one to air here in the U.S., Sidney and Amanda are dating, which normally this wouldn't be a problem, particularly in the Church of England, where we have priests that can get married there. It just so happens that, again, this is the 1950s in England, and Amanda is a divorcee. And it is not permitted at the time for a divorcee to get remarried. So in dating Amanda, Sidney is going a little bit against what the church teaches at the time. So as the season comes to an end, Sidney has to make a choice. Is he going to continue in his relationship with Amanda? Or is he going to follow the call that God has set out for him? And as you can imagine, this is not an easy choice for Sidney to make. It takes conversations with his superiors. It takes getting away from the parish for a little bit. In fact, finding himself in a Romany camp, even. And, of course, it takes 2 murder mysteries for Sidney to really stop, reflect, and figure out what he wants to do. Now, of course, this being a television show, it's made as dramatic as possible. So we know Sidney makes his choice when he shows up to Amanda's house in his collar. Amanda looks at him, knowing what choice he's made, and is despondent and tells him to leave, to not come back. This division that we see here going on between Sidney and Amanda, it's very much what we hear about in our gospel this morning. Because Jesus tells the crowd that he has come not to bring peace, but a sword. He talks about the division that happens between father and son, mother and daughter. This division is precisely what we see with Sidney and Amanda. Because it's not that Amanda doesn't love Sidney. She does. It's just that she's not willing to share Sidney with God. And that's a terrible, terrible thing, that she's not willing to do that. Because our relationship with God is the most life-giving and life-affirming thing possible. We're talking about the creator of the world here, the person who gave us our very being. So our relationship with God is what gives us life. It's what gives us purpose. And if someone truly loves us, this is what they want for us. This relationship with God. Because nothing else compares to it. When our relationship with God is not going well, is failing, we often find that there's a hole there. We often notice that in our lives. And no matter what we do to try to fill it, nothing quite fits into that hole. So for Amanda to not be willing to share Sidney with God, this is a terrible, terrible thing. Because this life-giving, life-affirming, wholeness-giving relationship that we have with God is something that anyone who loves us truly should want us to have. This division we hear about from Jesus, this division that goes on between those following God and the world, that's not part of Jesus' primary mission. So we know Jesus came into the world out of love for all of us. God came into the world to bring all of us back to God, back in relationship with our Lord. But there are some that try to divide us in that relationship. That's what Jesus is talking about this morning. The division he's talking about is those who don't wish for us to have that relationship with God. And oftentimes, it's for the very reason that Amanda doesn't want Sidney to have this relationship. Because we're not willing to share one another with God. We want that other person to have room only for us in our lives. That's not the life we're called to, though. We're called to have a life that is affirming of God. And we're also called to throw away, to push aside any of those things that keep us from that love of God. This is very much what we've been hearing throughout this entire month in our readings from Luke. We began at the very beginning of the month talking about greed, talking about how greed and those things like it can divide us from God and our relationship with God. It just so happens today, in continuing that trend, we learn that sometimes there are relationships in our lives. Sometimes relationships with our families and those we love the most. That can be those things that divide us from God. And so what Jesus is telling us is, like all things that divide us from our relationship with him, we have to remove that from our lives. We have to purge it and focus solely on our relationship with God. There is hope here, though. And the hope is in that God is calling us to be not only in right relationship with our Lord, but with other people. So what we are called to do is to not be that dividing factor, to not be what creates that division in the world. We're called to be there for our loved ones, to help them, to help build them up in their relationship with God, while also realizing that, as the situation with Amanda and Sidney, that's not always possible. But we are called to try. We are called to try and help our loved ones in their relationship with God. For those of you who were here Wednesday, you'll remember our reading from Mark that night. That those who put aside houses and families and all these other things to follow after God, to follow after that mission, will receive 100-fold back. That's our other hope, is that when our families don't want us to have that relationship with God, when they're not willing to share us with God, we have this family here, this family, the church. And as such, we are called to help one another. That's not just those who we love or who we like in this church. We're called to be there to help every single one of us here. That is our call in faith. In following Jesus, in following God, we're called to make that relationship the single point, the single focus in our lives. That sometimes means pushing other things away. And sometimes that means that there is a division between ourselves and our loved ones. But still, our focus needs to be singularly on that relationship with God. It is the only thing that can give us life and purpose. But our hope is that we can be a help to others, whether it's our loved ones, our family, or those here in the church, because we cannot make this journey alone. We need the help from one another. We need the help not only from those that we actually like, but those who just merely walk on the journey with us. We don't give preferential treatment to those we love or like. We give the same treatment to all that walk this journey with us. We are called to help all of those around us to walk in their journey with God. So, as you leave here today, remember that focus is always on God and our relationship with God. There may be times that people try to steer you away from that relationship. Don't let them do that. And also, be there for your fellow Christian. Be there in helping all of us live out our baptismal vows and build each other up in our relationship with God.
Amen.